This podcast is brought to you by AJ Bell and Shares Magazine. Shares Magazine is published by AJ Bell Media, part of AJ Bell.
Hello and welcome to the first AJ Bell Money Markets Deep Dive podcast. This is a brand new series which aims to take a longer look at some of the key issues in markets and personal finance. I'm Laith Khalaf, and joining me today is Charlene Young. Hi, Charlene.
Hi, Laith, and thanks for having me on for the first episode. So over the course of this year, we're going to be taking, as Laith says, a deep dive into a diverse range of topics, including everything from artificial intelligence, retirement planning, and that kind of debate on whether actively managed funds are a dying breed. But for our first episode, we thought we'd take a look at the big rise in taxation we've seen in recent years and how you can protect your money from tax. This is an issue that affects everyone. It's constantly in the news, and we thought it was pretty timely in that case to dive into this subject with the Chancellor's spring statement at the end of the tax year just around the corner.
Yeah, we're going to be focusing in on personal taxes, those that have risen, and the ways that you can save tax on your savings and investments. We'll be talking to Tom Selby, Director of Public Policy at AJ Bell, about whether a pension is better than an ISA, and if the government might try to water down the generous tax benefits currently enjoyed by pensions. Now, it goes without saying that none of this is personal financial advice. Tax is very much a matter of individual circumstances, but hopefully what we're going to do is give you some helpful pointers, a bit of food for thought, and we're going to also be including a little bit at the end about ways to avoid the 60% tax trap, but more of that later.
Yeah, we've got some special interviews lined up as well. So in this episode, we've got a great interview with Carl Emmerson, who's Deputy Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. So the IFS, if you're not familiar, is one of the EK's leading independent economic think tanks. And they've been a really important contributor to the national debate on all things economic policy. So Laith's going to be asking Carl why taxes are so high, whether they're going to get even higher, and asking whether we do really need the OBR and the Chancellor's fiscal rules. But before we get to that, Laith, I think we probably need to take a look at exactly where we are, what's the current state of affairs in terms of this UK record tax burden.
Yeah, so I mean, the picture as it is at the moment, for anyone who's picked up a paper, you probably already know it's not great. We're on course for a record tax burden. So this phrase, tax burden, gets kind of bandied around quite a lot. What it means is the percentage of economic output, the percentage of GDP that's paid in tax. So the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, reckons by the end of this Parliament will be at 38.2%. That will be a historic high. We're currently at 36.4%, so we're not there yet. So again, what that means is that for each £1 the economy produces, around 38p will be taken up by the tax take. And the OBR says that much of that increase is actually coming from personal taxes and capital taxes, i.e. taxes on individuals and assets. So just to give you a bit of context, because sometimes these numbers don't really mean anything unless you kind of look at what happened previously. Before the pandemic, the tax burden was around 33.1%. If you go back to just after World War II, it was 37.2%. That's the previous high watermark that the OBR thinks we're going to go through in 2029. We're not quite there yet. Clearly, there's quite a lot of water to go under the bridge between now and then, and things could be better or worse than that. And a lot of this millennium, it's been in the low 30%. Kind of feels like we might be breaking out of a trend into the higher 30s. Charlene, it's that difficult time of life when you maybe move. You're halfway through a decade. You're 35. You're 45. Suddenly, the next decade is a little bit closer than the last one. So it's kind of got that feel about it. And it's also important probably to recognise that what we're talking about is a percentage of the economy. And the economy is really big. It's currently £2.4 trillion per annum. So even really small differences in the tax burden add up to actually quite big cash sums, and they can add to very big changes for individuals, individual taxpayers, and also business taxpayers as well. So, Charlene, I think you've got a list there just to give us a kind of flavor of the main personal taxes that we've seen go up in recent years, right?
Yeah. So turning kind of first to investments. The one I wanted to pick out first was the dividend tax. So the income tax rate that's paid on investment income. Now, that actually went up back in April 2022, and there was a 1.25 percentage point rise across the board. So there's actually 3 different income tax rates that apply to dividends above any tax-free allowances. So 8.75% on dividend income that sits in what we call the basic rate tax band. Above that, so any dividend income that sits in that higher rate is taxed at 33.75%. And if you're an additional rate taxpayer, that dividend income sits on top of your income and could be taxed at 39.35%. Then if we cast our minds back to April 2016, we saw a bit of an overhaul in how dividends were accounted for and the introduction of a new tax-free allowance for them set at £5,000. So on top of the regular personal allowance, which is used up generally by earnings first, the potential for another tax-free slice of dividends. But sadly, since then, it has been obliterated. So first cut down to £2,000 in April 2018, then down to £1,000 in April 2023, and now to £500 that we have for the current year. So what does this mean? Well, it hammers even smaller shareholders who've got shares outside of those pension and ISA wrappers. And, that's borne out in the figures on the numbers of people paying dividend tax too. So the number of people paying dividend tax this tax year will be almost double what it was back in 2021-22. So that's one investment tax that has gone up. The second one is capital gains tax. So that's the tax on the profits or gains that you make when you sell or transfer assets. Now, it's been meddled with a lot over the years, but the most recent hike came in last October's budget, where the main rates of capital gains tax were increased on that day itself to bring them in line with the rates for property. So to confirm, there's the lower rate of tax at 18% now that applies to gains that would sit within someone's basic rate income tax band. Any gains that would sit in the higher rate tax band are now taxed at 24%. So the fact that there's 2 rates and the interaction with your income tax rate makes it a little bit more complicated to work out how much tax you might pay than if it was just a flat rate of capital gains tax, for example. And that's because you have to work out how much of that gain would sit in the different tax bands when added to your income, even though it's actually capital gains tax that applies, not income tax. So those are kind of examples of tax rates that have gone up.
And that's actually quite bad for small shareholders, isn't it? Because actually it's a really complex tax as well. And we've also seen the CGT allowance cut as well from over £12,000 as well.
Yeah. So the tax rate itself has gone up. And then we've got this kind of in-year where gains halfway through the year are taxed at a different rate. And you have 2 different rates to contend with. It's actually just really quite complicated and come a long way since Alistair Darling introduced it. He made lots of changes. He introduced one flat rate that was quickly kind of kiboshed by George Osborne back in the day. And yeah, as you mentioned, again, another tax-free allowance that has just been absolutely cut to pieces. So, down from £12,300, more than half to £6,000, it now sits at £3,000. So that's the amount of gains or profits you can make when you sell investments or transfer assets before CGT will apply. And again, it's just bringing smaller shareholders into, a tax that generally it is paid by sort of more wealthy, more business owners, people selling their own business potentially. So that's kind of the main rises in taxes and also slashed allowances. But there's also the kind of third and final one I wanted to cover off with stealth rises. Now, that's where we talk about frozen personal tax thresholds and everything from kind of income tax or to inheritance tax thresholds as well. And that kind of infamous fiscal drag effect that we're now all really kind of familiar with, I should say. Fiscal drag was a term that's kind of bandied around by people like us. And now it sort of became a bit of a household name, particularly under Jeremy Hunt and his nickname that he inherited there. So the freeze in personal tax thresholds, most of them that applies to income tax, started in 2021 and it's going to continue until April 2028. Inheritance tax beyond that. And basically, what does this mean? So it means if wages are rising, but these thresholds and allowances aren't keeping up, people find themselves dragged into either paying more tax maybe even a higher tax band, or even paying tax for the first time. So, if you think about the full new state pension, even that's approaching the kind of personal allowance for income tax now, with some pensioners actually already above that on their state pension alone if they've built up credits under the old system.
Yeah, it's a really clever way for governments to raise tax because it means they don't put up the main rate of income tax. So you don't get headlines saying income tax has gone up from 20 to 22%, but instead you still get kind of the tax take from people's wages, just pushing them up into higher tax bands.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's a great summary of kind of all the main kind of tax changes that I think we've seen for personal taxes. There are kind of other bits and bobs going on as well. But those are the ones I think that are kind of focused mainly on kind of the ones that we all kind of feel probably day to day, particularly with a focus on savings and investments as well. Now, as we said at the top of the show, I caught up with Carl Emmerson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies just to talk about the current situation in terms of tax and spending. He had some really top insights. So here's what he had to say. Carl, thank you for being with us today. Let's talk about the UK's tax burden. It's going to be a record high of 38.2% of GDP by the end of this parliament. Can you just give us an idea of how did we actually get here? Is it a natural result of spending in a pandemic, the energy crisis, or is there something more long-term going on?
Absolutely. I mean, it's worth saying at the start that is a record level by UK standards. We've never had a tax burden, never sustained a tax burden in this country that high, but it's not uncommon internationally. So if you go to Western Europe or Scandinavia, you often see tax burdens of that level or more. So it's not that unusual. I think the causes are really about a combination of factors. One of them is really about sort of long run pressure that's been continuing, which is around an aging population, combined with the fact that as we get richer, we want better healthcare, better social care, and that's costing more. And for many decades, chancellors were able to play a trick where they increased the share of our national income they were spending on the NHS, and they were cutting the share of national income that we spent on defence. That happened after the UK's withdrawal from east of Suez. It happened as a result of the end of the Cold War and then peace in Northern Ireland. But UK spending on defence is now down at the sort of NATO level, sort of target of 2% of GDP, and it's pretty hard to see it going any lower, and it may well go up. So the next few years might be a period in which we see both defence and NHS spending both rising at the same time, which is pretty rare. On top of that, we've got the fact that the government borrowed a lot of money for good reasons, but borrowed a lot during the financial crisis, during the terrible recovery from the financial crisis, and during the pandemic, and during the cost of living crisis. So 3 great big negative shocks in a row, lots of money borrowed. That means a lot more money on government debt. And whereas in the 2010s, that government debt was effectively financed at very, very low interest rates. So we weren't spending very much on debt interest. Now interest rates are much more at kind of usual levels. That means we're now spending much more on debt interest spending, huge amounts, over £100 billion a year now being spent by the government on servicing that debt. And I think the third phenomena is that spending on debt interest, that's never desirable. But actually, if the interest rate is high, but you're getting high growth, perhaps you don't really feel the pinch because, yes, you've got to spend a lot on debt interest, but that high level of growth gets you a load of tax revenues. It feels particularly painful at the moment because we've got kind of normal levels of interest rates, if you like. But what we haven't got is what we would regard, at least pre-financial crisis, is normal levels of growth. Growth has been absolutely terrible in the UK between 2008 and today, and the outlook going forwards isn't much better either. So weak growth going forwards makes those spending pressures, for example, on the NHS, sort of harder, more expensive. It makes servicing that national debt also feel more painful.
Okay, so quite a lot of factors there. And, as part of that, we obviously had a big tax raising budget in October. When you look at the state of the public finances now and the latest economic readings that we've had since then, how likely do you think it is that we'll see more tax rises from the Chancellor this year?
Well, the Chancellor has said that she doesn't want to do more tax rises. And I think perhaps that's not surprising, given both the fact that we're already at a record and the fact that she did such a big tax increase in the autumn. plus that big tax rise in the autumn was coming on top of a set of tax rises that the Conservative government had put in place. So the desire not to increase taxes any further is clearly understandable. I think the challenge is, well, what she hasn't done is left herself with much wiggle room, though. So the spending plans, she's spending quite a lot in the current financial year, quite a lot in the coming financial year. But beyond that, the plans for spending on public services looks pretty tight. And she's not on course to meet her plans for borrowing, her fiscal targets, with much headroom. So she hasn't given herself a lot of wiggle room if, for example, growth disappoints, or if she decides, actually, I need to be a bit more generous to public services. So I'm sure that she wants to try and avoid further tax rises. Whether she actually manages to avoid them or not will depend in part on factors outside of her control. We can all hope that growth might exceed the forecasts and give her a bit more revenue, and she won't need to come back for more. What we don't have much sense of is what would she do if growth disappoints? Will it be even tighter spending plans going forwards? Will it be that the fiscal targets get jettisoned, or would she indeed come back with more tax raising measures?
Okay, I mean, we'll come to the forecast in a minute, I think. Let's just focus in terms of this year, the kind of fiscal events that we're going to get this year. So the Chancellor said we're only getting one fiscal event a year, which we're expecting to be a budget, which will be in October or November. But the Chancellor is going to make a spring statement to Parliament on the 26th of March. And part of that is going to be the economic forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility. So, how credible is it that she might have to stand up in Parliament and say, we're not meeting the fiscal rules, but not actually introduce any significant policies at that point to try and amend that?
So under legislation, the government has to publish 2 economic and fiscal forecasts a year. They're produced by the OBR, and the Chancellor traditionally adopts them as his or her own. So that's what we're getting later in March, the spring forecast that's coming. I think in a grown-up world, there'll be nothing wrong with saying, look, okay, these forecasts have been produced. It looks like we're on course to miss our fiscal targets, but don't worry. If that's still the case, we'll come back in the autumn. We'll have a budget then. Obviously, forecasts are uncertain. Things will get revised. Maybe we'll be okay. But if not, we'll take action at that point. And I think in some ways that might be really quite desirable, because we don't think we should be changing tax policy. There's no real need to be changing tax policy or spending policy twice a year. One fiscal event a year is plenty. Rachel Reeves is right about that. But I suspect in reality, if the forecast comes back and says, look, you're on course to miss your fiscal target, I think the politics of that be very, very difficult. I think in reality, she'd have to take action to try and meet it. And it is a shame, because at the moment, what she's trying to do is say, look, I want to be on course so that in 5 years' time, we'll be raising enough in revenue to cover our day-to-day spending. And she's got a surplus of 10 billion. That's next to nothing in fiscal terms. And economically, it doesn't really make any difference if the OBR is saying, oh, you're on course for a 10 billion surplus in 5 years' time, and we're on course for a 10 billion deficit. There's no real meaningful difference between those numbers. They're pretty small in the context of an economy that's producing over 2,500 billion pounds of output per year. But I think the politics of producing a forecast where there's a current budget deficit, where she said she wants that to be in balance, I don't think she would be able to withstand wait till the autumn, I'll come back then. I think there's just a problem with this framework we have, which requires 2 forecasts a year, and yet for good reasons, only 1 fiscal event a year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. It makes sense to have kind of that 1 fiscal event a year, but when you've got those kind of 2 kind of scorecards every year, it makes it really difficult to do that.
And what this is really coming from is the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty out there. Forecasts change a lot, and yet Rachel Reeves is choosing to meet her fiscal target with a very, very small amount of headroom. If she had put in a big amount of headroom, a substantial buffer, then she would be much more confident she could get to the spring forecast and not have to take action, because a normal size downwards revision to the forecast wouldn't blow her off course. It's this combination of having a fiscal target, but also planning to meet it with next to no headroom.
Yeah, which kind of successive chancellors have done, really. I mean, can we just talk about the role of the OBR and the fiscal rules for a minute? I mean, the OBR does tend to get it in the net quite a lot, but really they're only kind of providing estimates of progress against targets that have been set by the government, right? So, in terms of those fiscal rules, why do we actually need them? So, because sometimes, as you might argue now, they do seem to be an impediment to chancellors doing what they think is the right thing. They move around a lot, those kind of the forecast, whether you're meeting your fiscal rules, moves around a lot because of things outside the government's control, like interest rates. And, when the heat gets turned up high enough anyway, it seems like the chancellor just moves the goalpost and changes the rules anyway. So is there a good reason why we have those fiscal rules?
So the reason we have an OBR is that their job is to produce economic and fiscal forecasts, to be independent in producing them, and to be transparent about how they come up with their numbers. So you don't have to agree with them, but at least you know why you would disagree. And we can be confident that these are drawn up by experts who are not politically motivated. Under the previous system, prior to the introduction of the OBR, it was the Chancellor's own forecast, and back then it was always a he, could just say, well, I think growth's going to be stronger, or I just think that taxes are going to come in higher. They were perfectly entitled to do that, and therefore the forecasts were subject to politically motivated wishful thinking. So we've got a better system having an independent organisation producing the forecasts. They don't tell the Chancellor what to do, though. The Chancellor has chosen to set themselves some fiscal targets, and then the OBR says, well, these are our forecasts. I've given your fiscal targets. You're on course to meet them, or you're on course to miss them. And it's up to the Chancellor to decide what to do about it. In terms of why have fiscal forecasts, why have fiscal targets? I think one possibility is you want to have them so you can explain to the electorate what you're trying to achieve, that you can try and use it as a way of convincing people that you will be responsible in how you're managing the nation's finances. Another rationale is you want to try and convince the financial markets, those who are lending the UK government money, that you're going to be responsible, that you won't decide to raise lots and lots of more money in borrowing in the next few years than what you are claiming. And you won't, for example, try to over borrow. A third one is you might decide you just want to try and tie your own hands. You might worry that actually you lack a bit of self-control. It's always easier to borrow perhaps than it is to cut spending or put up taxes. So maybe it's a kind of self-control device that either a chancellor puts on themselves, or perhaps more realistically what they put on their cabinet colleagues, so that when you're trying to do a spending review and you're trying to negotiate with health, education, justice, local government, transport, if they all come back and say, look, we need more money, just borrow more, perhaps the chancellor likes to have in their back pocket, I can't do that because we've all agreed these fiscal targets, they've been legislated. That means that borrowing more isn't an option. So it might be part of that kind of cabinet negotiation, the machinery of government, as the Treasury's trying to make a spending review stick.
Yeah, got you. Okay. Well, I mean, can we just focus in just on one of those? Because we had sort of a bit of a blowout from the kind of bond market at the beginning of the year, probably kind of overhyped really. But if the government did change its target significantly, or change the kind of fiscal framework, do you think the bond market would actually freak out and it would actually cost the government more to do that?
I don't think they would. I don't believe that many bond traders are looking very carefully at the detail of the government's fiscal targets. I don't think that's what they really care about. I think they care about a broader sense of how is the UK Chancellor and the UK government managing the public finances.
And presumably they've got their own numbers that do that. They don't need the OBR to provide them with that, right?
They can use the OBR's numbers. They can produce their own numbers. They're using their own metrics to decide whether borrowing a lot more money, for example, is appropriate or not, and their own judgments on whether the government's credible in terms of, and essentially because the fiscal targets at the moment say in 5 years' time I'll have a current budget surplus. One way the Chancellor's doing that is penciling in pretty tight spending plans for years 3, 4, or 5. It might be that the bond markets don't really believe they'll happen. Chancellor's also claiming that they'll be increasing field duty each year over the next 5 years, which is something that Rachel Reeves has chosen not to do this year, and no Chancellor has done for over a decade now. So again, you can have a fiscal target that's met for rather dubious reasons. So I don't think the bond markets are focused on that. And indeed, the wobble that happened in January looked much more about what was happening in the United States, where the cost of government borrowing rose by even more than what it did in the UK. And if you go back to the UK's kind of disastrous experience around the Liz Truss quasi-Kwarteng mini budget, I don't think just by having some fiscal targets, it would have meant that all would have been fine. I suspect the bond markets were nervous about a whole range of factors, including what had been done to institutions like the Treasury, like the OBR, like the Bank of England, like the fact there was a big tax cut without any attempt to show how the numbers added up, like the fact there were claims by the then Chancellor that there'll be further tax cuts to come. So I think it was a combination of factors, not a kind of, if only you'd had some fiscal targets, all would have been fine.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, fiscal targets are here, the OBRs here. We know those forecasts are really important. I mean, in terms of the modeling that they use, how accurate is it? And, can it really, can it really accurately forecast what the effect of a big change of policy is? So, for instance, something like the 6% cut to corporation tax that Liz Truss wanted to put through, that must be hugely difficult to model because its effect on economic growth depends on the responses of tens of thousands of companies across a range of industries, including some big multinationals. They may or may not want to decide to invest in the UK for a whole host of reasons apart from the tax they pay. So how accurate really can those forecasts be?
So the OBR's forecasts are really not very accurate at all, but I think it's important to remember in context. I think the analysis suggests they are slightly more accurate than what the Treasury was before the OBR came into being.
Okay, so there's some progress. Yeah.
So it looks like maybe some progress. I think a lot of the gains from the OBR are about the transparency, about the fact that you can see their work. They show they're working. Even if you don't agree with it, you can see that. You can see what they're assuming. You can see how they've reached the conclusions that they reach. Why are they not very accurate? Because it's just really hard. Even if there's no policy changes, trying to forecast what will the cash size of the economy be in 5 years' time, how will that be distributed across companies, across individuals? Therefore, how will it translate into tax revenues? How much will be spent on working age benefits, on pension benefits, on different public services? How much we spent on debt interest? Once you've got your forecast for total tax receipts, for total spending, take the difference. How much, therefore, will we be borrowing? It's a huge number of assumptions, really hard to do. But that's not to say you shouldn't bother. It's like the way I think about it is you've got a map. It's a really, really bad map. It's better to have the map than it is just to chuck it out of the car window, though, even though, it's a really bad one. What it means, though, for the Chancellor is, of course, when you take these forecasts, you have to think about, well, given these forecasts, given what they're saying is a central expectation, how do I want to set policy? But then I also need to think about the uncertainty there is in the world, the fact that things might turn out a lot better or a lot worse. That might mean that some policies are more attractive than others. It might mean I need to stay nimble because I know that things might not go the way, or that things won't go the way I expect. And I need to think about how I respond and try and think about how I can have policies that can respond appropriately rather than saying, right, this is what I'm going to do and I won't change anything because it's clearly rubbish. We know the forecast won't be right. We know the Chancellor will either end up lucky and have much more revenue than they expect, or they'll end up unlucky and they'll have harder choices to make in that world. But I think it's still worth having the forecast. And that's before you even take policy changes. You're very right. If you make a very big change to policy like corporation tax, you can do a relatively simple calculation that says if no one changes their behavior, what would this tax cut cost? And then you have to start thinking through about how might people change their behavior? How much extra investment might we get? What might happen to demand in the economy? How much stronger might the economy be in 5 or 6 years' time if that investment is done well and it makes us more productive? How much extra tax revenue might that generate? So there's a whole load of sort of knock-on questions you have to make after you've done the much more simple calculation that says, even if no one changes their behavior, how much would this tax change raise or cost?
Okay, great stuff. Thanks very much for that, Carl. Thank you for joining us.
No problem. Thank you.
That was Carl Emmerson, Deputy Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And thanks to Carl for coming on the show. Now, really interesting kind of insight for anything like me and kind of like to know what's going on and maybe put yourself in those ministers' shoes. And I think the kind of main things I really got from that was, is one fiscal event, one budget, shall we call it? That feels like enough each year, doesn't it, Laith?
I definitely say so. Yeah, from my point of view, personal interest in less work, that would be great.
Yeah, and just like really interesting insight again, how those fiscal rules, perhaps, but hindsight is a wonderful thing, isn't it? Perhaps Rachel Reeves might regret not perhaps giving herself enough headroom with those targets and spend, that percentage spend targets, but also actually, thinking about it from what Carl's saying in terms of it's quite an interesting stick approach, potentially if you've got cabinet colleagues kind of queuing up asking for some more money for the public purse.
I thought that was a really interesting insight. Actually, it's quite useful to kind of keep the rest of the cabinet in line. So yeah, thanks again to Carl for interview. So I think overall we kind of outline the current state of play in terms of that current fiscal situation, just to give people kind of a broader picture. Big question, of course, is how you can protect your savings and investments from rising tax. So we're going to start by taking a look at what I'd probably call the big two, pensions and ISAs, and then maybe get into a few more specialist areas of financial planning ideas. So Charlene, let's kick off with ISAs. So these were born in 1999. So they're now over 25 years old. You initially kind of had a stocks and shares, a cash ISA, and a life insurance ISA, actually. And initially it was a £7,000 maximum allowance. You now got a £20,000 maximum allowance, so it's a lot more generous. But we've also seen a big explosion in the family of ISAs as well. So you've got the stocks and shares ISA, which has always been around, the cash ISA, which has always been around. And then we've got some new additions to the family. We've got the lifetime ISA, we've got the junior ISA, we've got the help to buy ISA, and we've got the innovative finance ISA. And they're all slightly different, but one of the common themes across all of them is that you don't pay income tax on any interest from cash or from interest from bonds or loans within the ISA. You don't pay any income tax on dividends from investments, and you don't pay capital gains when you sell your investments. So that's always really important tax benefits there. The main two are cash ISAs and stocks and shares ISAs, which are the big two within ISAs, the most popular products. And all your growth and income there is tax free. So basically that means all the returns that your savings and investments are generating are flowing through to you, rather than you actually paying some to HMRC in tax.
Yeah, so if the kind of tax treatment or that tax-free treatment is the same, does it matter kind of which flavor of ISA that you use?
Yeah, I mean, they're all, as I say, slightly different. I mean, within the main two, stocks and shares and cash ISA, and that's kind of a division that applies to a number of different ISAs. So junior ISA and lifetime ISA also come in cash and stocks and shares flavors. Really, that comes down to whether you're putting money away for the medium and long term or for short-term goals. So if you look at your typical financial planner, what they'd suggest is holding 3 to 6 months money in cash, just as kind of emergency fund in case you lose your job, you have a big expenditure or whatever. And obviously a cash ISA is good for that, and you can receive any interest without paying tax. If you're looking at holding money for the medium and longer term, potentially even retirement, as we're going to discuss in a little bit with Tom, hopefully, you can start to consider a stocks and shares ISA. And the reason for that is, generally speaking, stocks and shares will do better over the long term than cash. But over the short term, markets, as we all know, can go up or down. So if you need your money in like 6 months' time, you don't want to put it in market, because if it falls 20 months, you're not going to get. If it falls 20%, you're not going to get a huge amount of money back, or not getting your capital back. So I think there is, this question. If you look at the market at the moment, whether too many people are holding cash. There are lots of people with lots of money in a cash ISA. Around 3 million people hold more than £20,000 in a cash ISA with no stocks and shares ISA at all. And of those, 1 million people hold over 50,000 in a cash ISA. So, if you're looking at kind of 6 months expenditure, if you've got 50,000 in a cash ISA, that's equivalent to kind of over £8,000 a month. So yeah, I don't know what your expenditure looks like, Charlene, but it feels like quite a lot to me.
I mean, if you ask my husband, he might.
Okay, all right. Well, maybe we'll leave that one there for an off mic discussion. But so I there is this question: are people holding too much cash? And even the FCA has looked at this. They reckon that back in 2021 they looked at this. They said too many people are holding cash. They said 8.4 million people were holding too much cash, and set about trying to reduce that number by 20%. Since then, it's actually gone up to 11.8 million. So more people putting money into cash, probably because interest rates have gone up. I think when choosing your cash or stocks and shares ISA, it's mainly a question of whether you're saving with short-term or long-term goals, particularly once you've got that kind of 6-month expenditure set aside in cash, whether that's in a cash ISA or a savings account. Lifetime ISA is a bit different, I think, and this is a relatively new addition to the ISA family, which comes with extra tax benefits and restrictions compared to cash ISA and stocks and shares ISA. So I think, Charlene, in terms of, it's a bit of a different beast, isn't it? And despite coming with those extra tax benefits, which are, once you put money in, you get a 25% uplift on your money, provided you then use it either to buy your first home or from the age of 60. So more tax benefits, more restrictions. But despite those extra tax benefits, Charlene, it's not really escaped criticism, has it?
No, and I think if you're kind of up to ask me, are they any good? And I didn't get asked that quite a lot, kind of in and outside of work. My view is I think so, but they could be much better with a few tweaks. So they've come up for a little bit of criticism of late, and also been subject to a review from the Treasury Select Committee, so a government committee that kind of will look at various aspects of what's going on and maybe dive into kind of, is this product working how it was intended to when it was set up back in 2017, and are people getting a good deal for it? So that kind of review or consultation, if you like, has just closed, and we've responded to it with our views on what could be changed for the better. So who do I think they're great for? Well, kind of the groups they were designed for. So most first-time buyers, self-employed, and people looking to also, employ people looking to top up their retirement savings. So personal point of view, I use mine for the latter. So I like to invest anything once I've mopped up kind of higher rate pension tax relief. And Tom's going to talk about kind of lifetime ISAs versus pensions for people kind of thinking about that. So, it's still getting me the bonus, and it builds me a nice extra tax-free pot at retirement. Obviously not advice, just another way of using the account. So the two main groups it is to dial in for are, those first-time buyers and trying to get people to put more money away for retirement, which you can't take out until age 60 without a penalty. Now, my main gripe is that the product has not kept up with the times. So quick recap, savers can withdraw money from a lifetime ISA without a penalty once they turn age 60. So the first cohort haven't quite got there yet. Or if you use it to buy a property costing up to £450,000 with a couple of other kind of caveats on you as a first-time buyer. If these rules are breached, you pay a 25% penalty. That penalty has actually netted the government £127 million since it was launched. So it's been a bit of a revenue raiser as well. And, what's the problem here? Well, the property limit, £450,000, was pretty reasonable when it was introduced back in 2017, but it has not changed since then. And people looking to buy in certain regions of the UK now face, either losing their dream purchase or suffering that penalty and maybe trying to top up the cash from elsewhere if they are able to put together some additional savings. Now, it's not just a London problem either. I think sometimes we all think, people obsessed about the housing market in London, but there's actually over 25 other local authorities outside of London where average house price purchases are above that £450,000 LISA limit. So if you're thinking of perhaps a couple or a young family trying to make their first purchase, they might be looking at a property that is going to go over that limit and find themselves asking, is this product, was it really worth it? Was it really worth putting that money away, even with the bonus? So, the penalty level itself needs another thing too. So 25% sounds like it just recoups the bonus the government's given you, but it doesn't. It works on the whole withdrawal when you're taking your money out. So you get the bonus, not long after you pay the money, and it's over between 1 and 2 months, 6 to 9 weeks, we normally say. But it's on the whole, the penalty is on the whole withdrawal. So at best, it's still just eating into your own returns, but actually in the early years of the product, especially if you're using a cash version because you're looking to buy a house in less than sort of 4 to 5 years, you really risk getting a lot less back than you actually put in. Now, the penalty itself was lowered in the pandemic to 20%. So I think one of the questions we've asked in the review is, why can't it go back to this? It's much more realistic. It's much more fair. It recoups the bonus, but you're not penalizing people for going into this product. And that's a massive problem, because this could be the first time someone has started investing outside of their workplace pension. Think the product's aimed at younger people. The first time they're DIY investing, potentially, investing for themselves. And it risks putting them off for the rest of their life, to be honest. And so it's no wonder that perhaps cash ISAs have, along with interest rate booms, seen another surge. And it's not quite the kind of UK investing culture that the government's, after kind of promoting. And even the regulator, as you mentioned before. So as we said, we've responded to that review. with a few tweaks, they could, really just be the perfect product for certain groups of people.
Okay, thanks very much, Charlene. So yeah, the lifetime ISA under review might be worth also mentioning. We have some reports in the press in the last couple of weeks. People are kind of pushing against cash ISAs as well, saying they should be abolished or cut back. There are kind of probably arguments on both sides of the coin there. I don't think it's going to happen, but also kind of worth keeping an eye on. Okay, so I think we've pretty well covered the main bases on ISAs there. We haven't talked a great deal about junior ISAs, helped by ISAs, or innovative finance ISAs. They aren't really quite as popular as the other three. But if you do want to know more about those, I can highly recommend the Money Helper website, which is an impartial money guidance website. It's backed by the government, and they've got a pretty good section on ISAs. And if you want to know even more about ISAs, in our main Money and Markets podcast is actually doing an ISA special in March, which will include a Q&A where we try to answer your questions. So if you'd like to pose a question to AJ Bell's team of experts, please do get in touch. Now, let's move on from ISAs to the world of pensions. Often much maligned, but pensions do come with extremely generous tax breaks. And we're very pleased to have Tom Selby, Director of Public Policy at AJ Bell, here to talk all things pensions. Tom, welcome to the pod. First of all, can you just maybe walk us through the tax benefits of pensions? How exactly do they save you tax?
Hello, thanks very much for having me on. So just to be clear, what we're focusing on here is defined contribution pensions. So those are pensions where you build up your own pot of money with a combination of your contributions, sometimes your employer's contributions, and pensions tax relief in there. So that's different to defined benefit pensions, which mainly exist in the public sector these days. And those are pensions where you build up an entitlement to a promised income based on the number of years you're a member of the pension scheme and what's known as the accrual rate. So for this conversation, we're parking defined benefit pensions to one side. It's defined contribution pensions and the tax implications on those that we're looking at. So when you pay money into a defined contribution pension scheme, you're entitled to what's called pensions tax relief. So what that means is that you won't pay income tax on the money that goes into that pension scheme. Now, there are different ways that different schemes will give you that tax relief. So some what are called net pay pension schemes, they'll take your contribution from your salary before income tax has been charged. And so in most cases, you'll get the tax relief automatically at what's called your marginal rate, so the rate at which you pay income tax. And then there's another type of pension scheme called a relief at source pension scheme, where you'll get basic rate tax relief, so 20% tax relief automatically, and then you can claim additional tax relief if you're a higher rate taxpayer or an additional rate taxpayer from the taxman. But essentially, one of the key benefits of saving into a pension is this ability to get upfront pensions tax relief. So if you're saving into a self-invested personal pension, for example, the way it will work is that if you pay £80 into your SIP, then you'll automatically receive an extra £20 through tax relief. So that'll top it up to £100. Then if you're a 40% tax payer, for example, you can claim that extra 20 quid you're owed from the taxman. Now, these are really generous entitlements that exist at the moment. And as such, the government has certain limits that are in place to make sure that its overall spending on tax relief aren't too high. So without going too far into the detail of those limits, because some of them are quite complicated, the main ones that people need to be aware of are the overall annual allowance. So that caps the amount you can contribute into a pension scheme each year at £60,000. So that covers employer contributions, your personal contributions, and that tax relief you get from government as well. And crucially, you can only contribute up to 100% of your earnings in total to your pension each year. So for example, if you earn £30,000, then you can contribute £30,000 a year into your pension, inclusive of pension tax relief.
Yeah, and it's important, that earnings one, isn't it? I think that sometimes catches people out, particularly people who might have a lot of income coming from investments or property. So yeah, thanks, Tom. That was a really good explanation of that. And, clearly that's generous tax treatment, as you mentioned, in terms of what the government is going to sort of help you pay in or give you relief on. But in workplace pensions, for example, can you expect your employer to pay into, right? And is there like a minimum that they need to pay in?
So absolutely. And in fact, workplace pension contributions, where you get that employer contribution as well are as close to a financial no-brainer as you'll get in terms of whether you should be in there or whether you shouldn't be in there. So as well as getting tax relief if you're saving in a workplace pension, your employer also has to, by law, offer you a pension scheme with what's often called matched contributions, so with employer contributions in there up to a certain minimum standard. Now, there are some rules around exactly who has to be offered those pensions through what's known as automatic enrolment. So you need to be aged 22 to 66 in order to qualify to be automatically put into a pension scheme. Now, you can choose to opt to go into a pension scheme if you're outside of that remit, but by law, it's if you're aged 22 to 66 that your employer has to automatically put you into that scheme. You need to be earning £10,000 or more, again, to be automatically put into your workplace pension scheme. But as long as you qualify for those rules, then your employer has to pay in at least 3% of your salary into the pension. You as an employee pay 4%, and then an extra 1% comes through tax relief. Now, unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as that for everyone. So the minimum contributions under automatic enrolment are calculated on a basis of a chunk of your salary. So salary between just over £6,200 and just over £50,000. So while it's 8% of your earnings that's supposed to be going in, actually, if you're auto-enrolled at the minimum, it's 8% of a chunk of your earnings that goes in, which means it might be significantly less than 8% of your overall salary. But it's a really attractive offer for people who are saving in a workplace pension scheme. You've got those employer contributions and tax relief. As I say, essentially free money and a financial no-brainer for most people. And the other thing to point out is that these are just the bare minimum that employers have to offer. Actually, lots of employers offer more generous terms than this. So if you haven't done this already, it's worth speaking to your employer to make sure you're making the most of any contributions that they'll pay in, because it's essentially 100% guaranteed returns on the money that you contribute to a pension.
Yeah, it's kind of free money, isn't it?
Yeah,
from your employer, which doesn't really make a huge amount of sense to turn your back on. But I think the big question that a lot of people think, Tom, we've obviously got these two main tax shelters, the pension and the ISA, which a lot of people already know about. I guess the big question people ask is pension or ISA, which is better? And I'm going to make it difficult for you, because we're going to take away that employer contribution, because I think that really skews it way in favor of pensions. If you've done your employer contributions and you're thinking I should put more in and I'm not going to get any employer contributions, should I do it into a pension or an ISA? What would you say is the answer there?
So my cop-out answer is it depends. So I'm not talking about the lifetime ISA here, although we can cover that later if that would be useful. So from a purely tax perspective, the difference between ISAs and pensions is that pensions get that upfront boost from tax relief that I talked about, whereas ISAs don't, excluding the lifetime ISA. And ISAs can be accessed tax-free at any point in time, whereas your pension can't be accessed until age 55. Today, that's going to rise to 57 in 2028. When you access your pension, the money isn't all tax-free. You can get up to a quarter of it tax-free, and the rest is taxed in the same way as income. So the reason my answer's a cop-out is it's going to depend on your circumstances and your priorities. So with a pension, you get that boost from tax relief, which will make it, from a tax perspective, more attractive than an ISA. But the terms of the deal are that you have to lock up your money, as I said, till age 55, possibly till age 57 in the future. So you're getting a bigger tax bang for your buck, but you're potentially having to lock your money away for decades. So the trade-off here for most people is that flexibility. So for lots of people, it'll be a combination of a pension and an ISA that will suit their financial needs, because you can get that ISA money flexibly, and for lots of people that'll suit their lifestyle and their aims. They won't want to lock up their money for a long period of time, but if you do lock up your money in a pension, you get that really good boost of pensions tax relief.
Yeah, and I think we talked briefly about lifetime ISAs earlier, and I mentioned how I like to use one to kind of top up pension savings. But if we're going back from kind of some of that niche stuff, thinking about, again, pensions versus a lifetime ISA, particularly for younger savers, are there any groups that might be skewing one way or the other? And what do you think?
Yeah, so it's a closer call in terms of the tax benefits between a lifetime ISA and a pension. So ordinary ISAs, so stocks and shares ISAs, cash ISAs, you don't get any upfront bonus for investing your money. With a lifetime ISA, you get a 25% upfront bonus, which is essentially the same as basic rate pensions tax relief. Now, the limit for a lifetime ISA is smaller than for a pension. So inclusive of that bonus, you can pay in £5,000 a year into a lifetime ISA versus £60,000 a year into a pension. But if you think of the particular group will be a self-employed basic rate taxpayer, if they're paying into a LISA, then they would get exactly the same bonus for saving in a LISA as in a pension. They get exactly the same tax-free growth in a LISA as in a pension. And while the access age is slightly different, so it's 60 for a lifetime ISA, 55 for a pension today, when you access the lifetime ISA, you can get all of the money completely tax-free, whereas with a pension, you can only get a quarter tax-free and the rest is taxed in the same way as income. So for that particular group of people, so self-employed workers who don't benefit from automatic enrolment, or who are basic rate taxpayers, or for people who are employed but are looking to top up their retirement savings over and above their workplace contributions that get an employer contribution, the lifetime ISA can be a really attractive vehicle. Now, there are also obviously some complexities in there with the lifetime ISA, so the age restrictions and the fact that there is an early withdrawal charge where you don't access the money in the way that the government is intending that you access it with a lifetime ISA, so specifically for a first home or from age 60. As a retirement savings vehicle, it's a genuinely quite a compelling offer, particularly for self-employed people who tend to not save as much for retirement as employed people, partly because they're excluded from those automatic enrolment reforms.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting one, the lifetime ISA, isn't it? Because it's kind of halfway, isn't it, between a pension and an ISA in a way. I actually think I got sidetracked for quite a long time, thinking, should I do a pension or should I do a lifetime ISA, and came down on the side of the pension because it kind of worked out better. I was saving for retirement. I didn't actually think for a while about should I do a lifetime ISA or a normal ISA, actually. And I was actually doing a normal ISA, which, I built up enough in there for kind of rainy day fund. So it was kind of for retirement anyway. So I probably wouldn't take it until I'm 60. So in that scenario, actually, I kind of realized I've been missing out on that tax relief, and actually I could have been doing a lifetime ISA as part of my ISA as well. So you can kind of see it both ways as kind of a retirement product, or kind of obviously kind of lifetime ISA is more tuned towards the housing product, isn't it?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think anyone who's listening to this who is aged between 18 and 39, who is in that position that you've just talked about there, you aren't quite sure which one is the right one. These are quite complicated decisions when you're purely comparing, the tax impacts of one and another and the bonuses of one another and what your overall goals are. It's worth considering at least opening a lifetime ISA before you reach your 40th birthday, because then at least you've got it there. You don't have to pay a certain amount into it, so you can just subscribe a small amount, and then that way you can, if you choose to, you can pay into it and keep benefiting from that 25% bonus right up until your 50th birthday. But if you wait until you reach 40, then it's done, the product's closed to you, and you won't have that option of using it either as an alternative to a pension where it suits you, or as a top up to a pension as you suggested.
Yeah, and I think just as Tom mentioned, a bit different to normal ISAs. To open a lifetime ISA, you actually have to pay something in as well. So that could just be a minimum amount, like Tom mentioned, but that's something that has caught people out in the past. So just be aware, you need to, by opening by age 40 means open and fund, really.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. And we talked, Charlie, you talked earlier about the lifetime ISA and about kind of the review that we're having of that at the moment. Tom, one of the things that we constantly see talked about endlessly, repeatedly, is the potential for the government to take away pensions tax relief, the generous treatment that we've been talking about. So, what are your thoughts here? Maybe, let's not keep it too open-ended, but let's maybe look at the current Parliament. You can't see all the way into the future. Let's give you 5 years. How do you see things in terms of whether the likelihood of that happening, I guess?
So it's an incredibly irritating, repetitive story that appears across the press ahead of every single budget. Now, luckily, we only have one budget a year, touch wood, as long as there's not going to be any changes between now and March, which means we should hopefully only get one round of the same rumours this year as well. So 2 rumours that usually do the rounds. One is that the ability to take tax-free cash from your pension is going to be either pared back or abolished altogether. And the second one, as you say, is that the way that pension tax relief works will be fundamentally changed. So usually the thing that people suggest is that rather than getting tax relief at your marginal rate, so getting back the income tax that you would have paid, instead you'd have a flat rate of pensions tax relief set somewhere between 20% and 40%, which everyone would receive. Now, those rumours are hugely damaging and destabilizing to individual investors. We saw ahead of the last budget that it changed behavior, particularly in relation to tax-free cash. So lots of people were getting at their tax-free cash before that budget announcement, largely, I suspect, because they feared that their ability to take tax-free cash was going to be taken away from the government. I think fundamentally, one of the challenges here is that we're asking people to potentially stash their money away for decades in order to enjoy a decent retirement, a well-funded retirement. And to my mind, the debate around the cost of pensions tax relief often misses the fact that actually this is a huge, significant financial decision for lots of people, particularly if you're in your 20s or early 30s. Locking your money away until age 55, that's going to increase to 57, is a big deal. And I believe that offering people tax relief, so essentially deferring the point at which they pay tax until they reach retirement, is a perfectly reasonable trade-off for people to do that. But one of the things we've been asking of the government is to at least try to deliver some stability in this area. So as you say, we know we're going to get exactly the same rumours ahead of the next budget unless the government chooses to do something. Now, to my mind, certainly introducing flat rate pension tax relief or scaling back tax-free cash are politically really, really difficult, if not impossible, in part because some of those who'd be most affected by those reforms are public sector workers, including people like doctors and senior clinicians in the NHS. Given the government's placed the NHS at the heart of what it's trying to do over the next few years, it seems to me almost impossible that they would look to make those fundamental changes, given that it might lead to strikes across the public sector. So our view is that it's very unlikely they'll do either of those things in this parliament. And rather than allowing the rumours to circulate, as they always do ahead of budgets, the government should come in and say, we're not going to change either tax-free cash entitlements or the way that tax relief works at the front end, at least for the rest of this parliament. Now, that's a difficult thing sometimes for governments to do, the idea that they're going to lock themselves into a specific way of tax policy, particularly, given the straitened fiscal circumstances the UK finds itself in. But I don't believe that politically they'd be able to do either of those things anyway, in which case it's sort of a free announcement to show that you're delivering stability and you're on the side of long-term savers. I'll come back in a year's time and they'll have probably upended the whole thing and I'll look incredibly stupid.
Yeah, well, almost impossible is what you're saying. Well, just less of a cop-out answer than I was expecting. So we're taking that and running with it.
I think it would be very, very difficult, and it would be extremely unfortunate if they did that, because, as I say, one of the big challenges that all Western countries are facing, right, is that people aren't saving enough for retirement. And if you upend the incentives that exist there, then you're at risk of making what is already quite a difficult situation even worse. To my mind, just giving people a bit of stability so that they can plan for the long term isn't a huge ask. Clearly, there are upfront costs to providing tax relief, but there's also a longer term cost to people not saving for retirement. There's a greater risk that people fall back on the state. So just delivering a bit of stability, at least over the course of this parliament. And ideally, we want it to be longer, given that people are saving for decades, as I say. But at least until the end of this parliament, I think would be a massive step in the right direction.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks very much, Tom. Appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
So, Charlene, we've dealt with pensions, we've dealt with ISAs as ways to save tax on your savings and investments, but there are other ways you can go about this, right? And that's particularly the case if you're married or in a civil partnership.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think about our tax allowances, our tax-free allowances, they are individual to you. We're familiar with our own ISA allowance, but the same principle applies to things, like I mentioned, like that personal allowance and the allowances for savings and dividend income, as well as a tax-free allowance for gains on CGT. So in terms of spouses and civil partners, one allowance you might be able to take advantage of is the marriage allowance. And this is all about sharing a portion up to 10% of your personal allowance. So that first £12,570 slice of income that most of us will get tax-free. Now, this works for people either married or in a civil partnership, as I say, where one person is a basic rate taxpayer, so your income comes in less than £50,270 a year, and the other person in the couple earns less than that personal allowance, that £12,570. So they wouldn't make use of their full personal allowance. So there is the ability there to share up to, or transfer, I should say, up to 10% of that to the partner with the higher income. So really, what does that mean? In the current tax year, you could essentially be gifting your partner an extra £1,260 of tax-free earnings a year, saving them up to £252 in tax. This allowance also applies. You might think, well, that doesn't apply to me. But if you have temporarily a smaller income, so perhaps you're on maternity leave, or you're cutting back your hours for a couple of years, for whatever reason. So if your circumstances have changed, maybe have a look at whether it's something that could apply to you and your husband, wife, or civil partner. And you can also backdate claims, I should say, for up to 4 years if you were eligible. And moving on to kind of investment side of things, dividends, splitting investments that are wrapped or transferring or gifting investments that aren't wrapped in an ISA or pension helps share that kind of measly £500 dividend allowance now. And it can also mean a lower tax rate on dividends if one of you has less income than the other. So think about those rates of dividend tax that I mentioned earlier, jump up from 8.75% for dividends in that basic rate tax plan to 33.75 dividends above. Tripping over my dividend, the dividend under rate tax band.
Be careful, mind the step. Yeah.
The potential saving is pretty significant there. Again, savings income, we've got a personal savings allowance for interest. So that gives you up to £1,000 non-ISA interest tax-free each year. If you're a high rate taxpayer, though, it's cut down to £500 or absolutely nothing for additional rate taxpayers. So again, if the lower earner can hold the bulk of the non-ISA cash, it could mean clawing back some of that tax-free interest too. And kind of finally on capital gains tax, we're talking about transferring these assets or gifting these assets. If you transfer assets between spouses or civil partners, that's exempt from capital gains tax, as they happen on what's known in the industry as a no gain, no loss basis. So that's really useful if you're planning to sell an investment, perhaps in the future, and your spouse or civil partner hasn't used their own CGT tax-free allowance for the year. Also, again, if they've got a lower income than you, it could mean that any tax due will be at that lower rate on the gain that exceeds any tax-free allowance they have left. So, if you are thinking about doing that, just make sure you keep a note of the original cost that you paid for the investment that you're transferring, as that cost or book cost also transfers across to your spouse or civil partner, and they'll need it when they come to sell the investment themselves. A bit of a whistle-stop tour there.
Great. Thanks, Charlie. Some great general finance advice there. Well, not advice, helpful tips, shall we say, for couples. Now, we've also talked a bit about the tax relief on putting money into a pension. You also need to be careful when you're drawing money out of a pension that you don't pay too much tax, right?
Yeah. So as Tom was mentioning, kind of when you come to draw your pension, up to 25% of the value you can generally take tax-free, perhaps as tax-free cash. But, your pension, we know, has got to lasting through retirement, but the pension freedoms did bring some flexibility on how you can actually plan your withdrawals. So traditionally, and actually lots of people today still like to take their 25% tax-free cash lump sum up front at the start. They like it. They know that it's a benefit of pension savings. They might have plans for it. Then you choose an income option for the rest. So that's where your drawdown or your annuities come in, or a combination of both. So once that tax-free cash has gone, or you've taken it, any withdrawals are subject to income tax, and they're taxed under the pay-as-you-earn PAYE system like employees are. So if we think about drawdown, you've got that flexibility to take as much or as little income as you like, but you will pay income tax on it. So, bear that in mind. You could be tipped into a higher tax bracket if you've got income elsewhere, or if you're looking to take a chunk out, or if you're still working part-time. So keep those kind of tax allowances and brackets in mind if you're thinking of that kind of tax-free cash and then income later option. One other thing some people like to do, rather than take that whole tax-free cash amount up front, you can take pension lump sums, and they are a lump sum that is 25% tax-free and 3/4 taxable. Again, that tax-free bit will use some of your tax-free cash allowance, but it could, throughout retirement, work out a little bit more tax efficiently if you're looking at that kind of point of view. On the flip side, it's a bit more time intensive to manage, as you won't have been setting up like an automatic income stream. So, whilst it might be more tax efficient in theory, there are other kind of costs or drawbacks that you might need to think about on your time. And also the way that your pension provider has to tax and apply tax codes to pension income, including these lump sums, can mean an added headache. We talk about this quite a lot in the press. So we have to apply what's known as an emergency tax code on a month one basis. That means that it could assume that you're taking this lump sum every month, which inevitably leads to you being overtaxed and you having to reclaim the overtaxation back. It's horrible. It's clunky, to put it mildly. Now, HMRC have changed the system slightly for people taking a regular income, so that regular drawdown income that I talked about from April this year. It will mean the right amount of tax is paid more quickly, hopefully less need to reclaim. But it doesn't help these people going for this other option of ad hoc lump sums. It still means that the first payment for almost everyone will inevitably be overtaxed. So, tax efficiency, great, but just think of the added kind of things that you might have to consider.
Yeah, really important when you're taking those pension withdrawals that you recognise that they are basically treated as income. And outside of pensions and ISAs, there is another tax shelter which we haven't mentioned so far, which are venture capital trusts or VCTs. And it's fair to say those are really for more experienced and adventurous investors. They're basically funds that invest in a portfolio of small, often unquoted companies. Sometimes they're quoted on the junior stock market, it's called AIM, the alternative investment market. And they're at a really early stage of their development. So that's why they're quite high risk. VCTs come with a 30% tax relief up front. So for each £10,000 you invest, you get a tax rebate of £3,000, which is quite a nice incentive, provided you have paid that much of tax. The HMRC isn't quite as generous yet. They're going to pay you back tax that you haven't paid. But that is kind of one of the big appeals of VCTs. And you also get capital growth and dividends, like with ISAs and pensions, are free from tax. So you do have to hold on to the VCT for 5 years to keep the tax relief. But really, if you're investing in really small companies, really small risky companies, you should be investing for more than 5 years anyway. So as well as VCTs, you might also see EIS, enterprise investment schemes, and SEIS, seed investment schemes. They also come with similar-ish tax benefits. But with all of these, more kind of the tax shelters that are focused on smaller companies, they do obviously come with high risks attached. So really for people who know what they're doing and really already have diversified portfolios and are willing to take on the extra risk. So, Charlene, we've got, I think, time for one more section, and we have not mentioned yet the 60% tax trap, which I think we want to cover. It's a really weird quirk of the tax system, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's at least a 60% tax trap, 62% minimum if you include national insurance as well. So what on earth are we talking about? So it's where people have income that tips them over £100,000 in a tax year. So what happens here? They start to lose their tax-free personal allowance that I've talked about. So you lose £1 of that tax-free personal allowance for every £2 you're over the £100,000 income limit. So not just earnings here. It could be, if you've got some property income or investment income as well. What does it mean? You pay 40% tax on a bigger chunk of your income. So think about it. If you have income of £100,000 for 1 year, and actually the next year it's £102,000, you lose £1,000 of your personal allowance. So 40% tax applies on that extra £2,000, but also the bit of personal allowance that you've lost. And that is how we get to our 60% effective tax rate. Although, as I mentioned with NI, it's actually 62%. Now, that 60% 62% effective tax rate applies on your income between £100,000 all the way up to the additional rate tax threshold, £125,140. Anything above that limit is then subject to additional rate tax, so 45% on earnings. So we've got this kind of really weird spike for a decent chunk of someone's income. And again, just another like horrible quirk, distortion, I like to call it, in the tax system, where, you know, things are far from simple. And just very quickly to mention something that I speak quite a lot about is, you know, for parents of young children, they'd already need to be paying back child benefit, but they would also at these levels lose any entitlement to government schemes like tax-free childcare and additional free hours in England and Wales. So here, that's not just a taper like the personal allowance, it's a complete cliff edge. And, you know, we crunched those numbers and got to some horrendous, dizzy figures about how that could translate to an effective tax rate of nearly 600%. Again, if you want to read more about it or you're worried that might apply to you, it was covered neatly in the Sunday Times this week. So just on the 9th of February, this weekend just gone. You know, the good news, though, is that, you know, you can reduce the income measure that is used to test against this threshold by making things like pension contributions. Pension contributions and donations to charity that get gift aid reduce your income for this purpose and maybe drag you out of that tax trap or that cliff edge as well.
Yeah, great stuff. A plea for tax simplification there, I think, as well. So thanks very much for that, Charlene. That's all we have time for in this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Do join us next month for a deep dive into a really hot topic, artificial intelligence. We've got some really exciting interviews lined up. For the moment, thanks for listening, and don't forget to tune in to our regular Money and Markets podcast, which will be out later in the week.
Before you go, please remember this podcast is for educational purposes, and the views expressed don't necessarily reflect those of AJ Bell or Shares Magazine. The podcast isn't telling you if a certain investment is suitable or not. Don't forget that the value of investments can change, and you can lose money as well as make it. It's also important to remember that how you're taxed will depend on your individual circumstances, and rules can change. The way an investment performed in the past may not be the same as how it behaves in the future. If you want help, go see a qualified financial advisor.